I've been wanting to share my stories and my family stories for quite some time now, and I've only told a few people, including a few YouTubers, but I don't think my stories have ever made it on any channel, or so I know of. Much of my family comes from the Saskatchewan area and Manitoba, and they all have their own harrowing tales to share. Like many people who inhabited those areas during the summer and winter months, have seen all sorts of things, everything from Bigfoot to strange shapes in the woods that they couldn't identify. But my family has had an issue with a being that has been following us for generations. I believe it's commonly known as the Wendigo, but I have never actually seen it myself, although much of my family claims to have. For example, when my father was young and would go out ice fishing with my grandfather up in northern Lake Winnipeg years and years ago, they would sometimes hear their name being called out from the far northern woods, which they knew meant danger. They would see ghastly apparitions at the forest tree lines, calling them, baiting them back in of their long-lost relatives. Seeing tall black figures watching them from the trees as they traversed through Canada's thick, barren, cold wilderness. The winters up north are some of the most unforgiving, and if you are unprepared, well, the cold will get to you. It doesn't take much to die from hypothermia and frostbite if left out in the conditions for too long. Something my family feels that this being stalking us will try and do. Will try and trap you in an area to where you get lost, so it can weaken you down by the cold, so it can approach you and do whatever evil it wants to do to you. My grandfather and his father had supposedly both lost siblings due to this being, mostly when they were little children and wandered too far into the wrong areas, being claimed by whatever this thing was. Of course, my grandfather, his father, and the people of the time knew well what it was and how to avoid it. They just made dire mistakes and paid a ghastly price for it. Assuming it actually is a Wendigo, which I haven't got any full acknowledgement from my family on it. Assuming these little children were caught by this thing, they were devoured whole and eaten entirely. I was told there was no remains ever found, no bones, no clothing even, only heartbroken mothers, and an endless stream of tears. Cousins, far aunts and uncles that I will never meet or hear stories about. This being wasn't just exclusive to my family and terrorizing them. It's pretty well known all over those regions. I'm fairly certain that there's large territories that these things roam, that people just avoid, or at least people who are knowledgeable about this being. It's interesting to me that most tribes have some sort of demonic being that plagues the people. For example, the Utes and the Navajo and the Apache all have skinwalkers. I'm sure I might be missing some tribes in there, but they generally have this same being that they talk about. My family doesn't just come from one tribe, but is more of a culmination of people that have come from different tribes over different periods of time, and have now come together. And there's a little Western European in there, which is kind of where I come from. And in the past 50 years or so, we've moved down into the States to get away from not only just this thing, which wasn't even one of the primary reasons we moved down here, but just because things were getting toxic. We needed a new place, new scenery, new people. This thing just happened to come with, and still continues to attack my family. My grandparents still seem to be a heavy target for this being, considering they're one of the original ones that moved down here to start the family with my father and my mother, and then some. My grandparents on both sides, mind you, so that my last sentence makes sense. Even as a little kid, I was never allowed to fully play in the woods by myself, ever, which I always thought was strange, but I never understood why until I was a little older, and my grandfather could sit me down and explain it to me, the reasonings why. They feared for my genuine safety, and then I would too be another victim of this thing. It took me a while to figure out exactly what this thing was, because they would never give it a name, because they feared if they did, it would be repeated, and if it was repeated, it would draw this thing in. And for that reason, I was never taught the actual native tongue word for Wendigo. Again, assuming that's exactly what this creature is we're dealing with. But I can tell you and confirm with you, it is some sort of demonic being, to my knowledge. And I know for a fact that one of its major components is that it does mimic voices and try to lure you into the woods, deeper, It's even used things like false imagery of past and previous family members to try and pull you back, just like the apparitions I was talking about earlier. For around 10 to 12 years, a major part of my family moved over closer in British Columbia, closer to Alaska. That's when things got even more tumultuous, with having encounters with territorial Bigfoot, and still, this being continued to follow them, even going as far as killing grizzly bears. I know that might come as a shock to you, and hopefully isn't too far-fetched to believe. I'm sure you get lots of crazy stories. I mean, I can only imagine. But when my own grandfather, a severely hardened individual by nature and time and life experience, is afraid of something more than a grizzly bear, there's just something wrong. It was also around the same time frame that in the northwestern region of British Columbia, they found several large animals with their hearts ripped out of their bodies. I'm talking bull elk, moose, grizzly bear, large animals that you should never find dead, let alone their hearts torn out of their bodies. Now, I understand this could also be due to in part of the territorial Bigfoot that were in the area, but there just seemed to be a looming eerie presence around these bodies when my grandfather discovered them. It was a different feeling than the Bigfoot, which, by the way, he never taught me the word for them either. Supposedly, this demonic beast would follow us around, ripping the hearts out of larger animals to consume and absorb its power. It's one of those things where I've had to ask myself, okay, is there actual truth to this, or is this just Native American lore? But my grandparents and the rest of my family are very stern, serious people. There's no room or time for games or stories or making things up. They've never really been about that, and even the culture that they are enriched in and have grown up in doesn't really support that either. Their purpose of telling me these stories isn't to woo and wow me, it's to warn me. It's so I make smart decisions based off the information they are giving me, and I will stay out of certain areas and won't do certain things. They care about my safety, and I'm aware of that. I suppose I would think all of this is just silly made-up stories to scare children. But I've done my research. I've looked into stories done by other people who are native to not only that territory, but specific tribes from those areas. And unfortunately, at least for me, they all have their own share of terrifying tales and stories from dealing with the same creature, at least described by the same actions. From the sounds of it, skinwalkers down in the southern regions of the US can mimic and kind of do the same things a Wendigo can do, but I feel that they are vastly different creatures, at least as far as my understanding goes. But if you really want a bulk of the horrifying stories, you gotta go back to the late 1800s, in Western Canada. That's where a bulk of all of this started, to my knowledge. Reportings of an evil cannibalistic spirit, people being lured into the woods and killed by what they thought were familiar voices, seeing ghastly figures from a distance, being grabbed and dragged away to never be seen again, only to having their bones found many months later, and the remains never fully discovered. I guess it kind of makes sense, us moving down here in order to partially avoid this creature, and the fact that we can't even do that. We're still dealing with the same problem. I don't know if it has to do with the fact that there's more of them, or what. Or, are we being followed by the same being, hunted, just like deer? What does it want with us? And why is it so insistent on tormenting me and my family? And even though my sightings and encounters with this thing have been very minimal, compared to that of my entire family, there's a reason. I stay far out of any woods I can. I don't enjoy camping, or hiking for that matter, because I'm always in fear that this thing's gonna show itself, or make an appearance somewhere along the way. I feel the constant need to be looking over my shoulder, and being constantly aware of my surroundings, never feeling fully comfortable, and I don't ever feel that I can completely let my guard down. Sometimes I wonder if there's a reason that this evil spirit has targeted specific families and people. Does it have anything to do with black magic? Does it have anything to do with past generations doing evil acts amongst each other? I'm not quite sure, and I can't find exact answers because even my grandparents won't answer those. The only thing I do feel is a target, and I know I will forever be a target as long as I live. Same with the rest of my family, because it doesn't seem to care who, what, or why. It's on a mission to destroy my family bloodline, or so it feels like. And with COVID-19, I do feel a little bit fortunate, and I kind of feel guilty for feeling fortunate, that I don't have to step foot in the woods. I can be locked away, safe in my house, not having to worry about this thing wandering up here and taking us away. I feel like for now, as long as my family and I aren't going out into the woods, by ourselves or with each other, I feel like we should be okay. For how long, I don't know. But fall's coming up here really soon, and my family relies heavily on hunting and deer for meat to get through the winter, which means that we need to go hunting, out in the woods. And I usually help with that, so I'm not really excited for what the fall holds. Just wish me luck, and hope that whatever this is haunting my family, I can have the power to ward it off. Through what means and how, I'm not exactly sure. I can only try avoiding this creature for so long before it eventually gets me. I mean, is it possible that there is any truth at all to the fact that there is an evil murderer spirit roaming the woods of northern Canada, known as the Wendigo? Or is it just all in our heads? I used to live out in the country, up north in Canada, far out in the sticks. You had to bike or drive to go anywhere, aside from a small little taco stand. At night, it would get pretty dark too. With my mother and stepdad, we had a few small dogs and a cat. I was often left in charge of all of them. I was kind of resentful for all the extra work, on top of my schooling and homework. But I loved the animals, so I couldn't blame them too much, unless they made a huge mess. Then I'd be pretty ticked. But that's not the entirety of why this is relevant. What is that I would routinely take them out, all before going to bed. I would go to bed very, very late at night, like any 14-year-old with such lax parenting. My dogs would usually stay in the front yard, which is a very vast acreage of flat land, with a tiny ditch. It was easy to see the small dogs and call them back in. Sometimes, the one dog would wander. My mother's terrier had a bit of a rebellious side to her, but it wasn't her who took off this night. It was the Cocker Spaniel. She was a protective and watchful eye, while the others were mostly divas. Frustrated, I ran after her around to the back of the house, which is a steep slope toward a waterbed that is an offshoot of the Red River. What I saw slowly sprawling across the slope, coming in our direction, still gives me the chills. These things were about chest height to me, and 20 feet away. Very grotesque looking, like they were covered in rotting dead flesh and tight skin with their bones exposed, but on all fours, with long legs that were longer in the back. They turned their almost rotting faces to look over at us at the top of the slope. Their eyes were large and glowed in the faint back porch lights, like big white marbles. Luckily, my dog had frozen at the top with me, her hackles raised like a hyena. The creatures were still walking and pacing around, making sure to keep an eye on us like we were a newly discovered threat. I grabbed the dog by crouching quickly, frightened we'd be attacked, and bolted around to the side of the house to the front again, calling for the others to quickly come inside. The other two dogs were already sitting at the door, waiting for us. I guess they figured it was too chilly for them to stay out for so long. But truthfully, my out-of-shape self was boiling from the adrenaline. I refused to take them out after dark after that, which unfortunately resulted in plenty of messes I had to clean up. I would occasionally see these strange things, these weird creatures wandering outside of our house after that. It gave me the creeps. They'd only look up at my house if I had the lights on and was obviously moving in clear view. Another night I woke up, radio flashing 3 a.m. or something around that. I wasn't sure why I woke up at that time, until I realized that I was not alone. I sleep in the basement at the time, my window overlooking the backyard, but only slightly. It was located under the back porch, which was able to be walked under if you simply stopped a bit. One of those things, which what appeared to be a rotting flesh skull-looking face, with dead, sunken-in eyes looked through in my window. I froze. I'm not even sure if I moved at all after waking up. It pressed its disgusting head against the glass for a brief moment and snorted real loud. I got the feeling it was scanning the darkness for someone. Me. After a minute, it pulled its head back and resumed the direction it was originally walking in. To this day, I have no idea what they were. They looked very skinny and emaciated, and appeared to have what I would describe as rotting flesh all over their bodies. It was putrid looking. They acted and moved very strangely as well, and walked on all fours, sometimes alternating to just 2 legs. They had really long legs and arms. I didn't see any claws or any other distinctive features. The only thing I could find when looking up any sort of myth was cryptids like the Wendigo or Skinwalker. But a Skinwalker is usually only a Navajo native thing, and up here, it's just not very likely. I don't know what a Wendigo looks like, although I know they're supposed to be a cannibalistic creature. I just don't know if they're depicted as looking like they have rotting flesh, aside from the simple distance making it hard to discern their faces. They stuck around long enough for me to get a really good look at them and their form. So, what was I seeing out there? Back during the summer of 2015, I had the most terrifying experience of my life. I've always been a rabid outdoorsman, and I've always been obsessed with camping. Really, anything involving nature, actually. I would go out camping with a couple of very close friends of mine who were also part native and knew a lot about the wild around them. It was very helpful in many situations, actually. We had gone hiking on all sorts of different trails, land and areas, even areas deep within my friend's reservation where most people don't go and have the proper permission to go out to. That's what makes the Resland so great. It's generally uncharted because many of the natives that live on it themselves don't bother to go out far into it. Here, the area was thick with wild game, like deer, black bear, and even cougars. On several occasions, we had gone far out into the wilderness on his tribe's land for miles, sometimes going as much as we could go in one day, just to see how far we could make it. The forest was always so full of life, especially out here, where normal white men like myself never get the opportunity to venture into. They held this place sacred, and would even hold off hunting it unless they absolutely needed to. Usually, every trip it would just be me and a couple of his family members that I was also close with. But the one time I went with him, I noticed something very eerie. We were exploring an area that we never had gone through before, a totally uncharted area for both of us. But we were confident. We were probably about 4+ hours into a long hike, and over the whole day, the forest had gone completely silent. I know we have cougars around, but generally, this isn't the case with a cougar, with the woods being silent. I waited as quietly as possible and surveyed my surroundings meticulously. The sun was still bright in the sky, and burning hot as ever on this warm summer day. It was weird to have so much light, so much daylight, and so little sound. That is when a very creepy thing happened. I heard my name being called out close by. It didn't sound normal though. It sounded weird. It sounded like somebody trying to mimic my native friend, who was right next to me at the time. And the voice sounded kind of distorted. It called out my name, telling me to come here. My friend looks at me, and he's sweating bullets now. He says something in his native tongue, and urges me that we needed to leave now. He kept telling me to not respond to it, no matter what it says, and we began to turn back the way we come. Whatever the thing had called out to me was close by in the woods, and now it was following us closely as we made our way back. It was just beyond my line of sight. My friend was starting to become incredibly nervous and kept whispering to himself in his own language. I think it was a prayer. I kept asking him what's going on, what's calling my name, but he wouldn't respond directly. He just kept saying that he'll explain later. We just need to get to a safe spot. This went on for a couple more miles until we passed through a large creek that this thing did not pass through, but continued to call out through me through the woods. It never revealed itself, whatever it was. There were these strange wooden structures, I guess if you wanted to call them structures. They were hanging from the trees, and I was told those are border markers of the Wendigo. We hadn't seen them before because when we crossed the creek earlier, it was an entirely different area of the creek, and the area that we didn't have the markers, so we didn't realize what laid ahead of us. We made it safely through the other side, and within no time actually made it back to where he was staying, just a few more hours of hiking. So maybe we were definitely more than 4 hours out. Once we got back, I could get him to thoroughly calm down and relax. He told me that what had happened was we came upon a Wendigo's territory in the woods. He should have known by the feel of the energy around us, but chose to ignore it because he thought his gut was misleading us. Wendigos are cannibalistic creatures that lure you in and devour you. Many have been lost to these creatures, even more during the night. They can read your thoughts and mimic those who are close to you in order to lure you in, trap you where they can get you. Had we gone just a little further into the woods, it would have gotten us. He had me freaked out by telling me all this stuff. His brothers and family confirmed this to be true with me right there and told us it's very dangerous to be in that area of woods. There is a reason that many of their people will not venture out into these places because, plain and simple, that's Wendigo territory. That is why his people and family only go out there hunting for food if they absolutely have to, because they know there is such a large risk involved in going to these places. You know, thinking back on it, the utter silence of the woods was incredibly disturbing to me, at least in this context. I've been in those situations before, where a mother bear was around with small cubs, but never like that. And I don't recall the woods going silent like they did there. You could hear a pencil drop, it was so quiet. To this day, Wendigo or not, I can't be 100% certain of what I encountered. Could it have only been a bear, or maybe something else, and my friends were overreacting? Possibly. But if that's true, then what was calling out my name and his distorted voice? And why was it following us so closely the entire way back to the creek, where there is supposed territory markers? It just didn't make any sense. That was one of the last times I went super far into the deep woods, and probably won't be going back anytime soon. My boyfriend, roommate, and I were doing some ghost hunting tonight. We live in Independence, Oregon, about 20 minutes south of Salem, and about 10 minutes from Western Oregon University, and we saw this strange light near the train tracks. At first, we thought it might be a person walking, or maybe someone on a bike, but then it just disappeared. There's nothing but brush on either side of the tracks, so we decided to check it out. We didn't run into anybody or find anything. I got a really bad vibe as we were continuing to follow the tracks, so we turned around. At first, we thought it might be the spirit of a miner, since there used to be coal mines around the area. But not too long ago, my boyfriend mentioned to me that it might have been a skinwalker, or maybe a Wendigo, and also mentioned a feeling of being watched. He and I have had before while walking along the Willamette River. I realized that the feeling I had had as we were walking along the tracks was the same feeling I had had when we were walking along the river. A feeling of being watched and stalked. We want to go back and investigate more, but I was wondering if anyone else experienced or knew of anything like this in the area. I think there's something strange living in the woods near my house. I live in a rural area in Mississippi. I won't say exactly where for privacy reasons, and the area is surrounded by a vast forest that is littered with deer camps and thick foliage. I've seen something weird in there since I was 13, but before I get into that, I want to give some context. My family has lived on the property since my grandparents moved there to start a family. My dad and his siblings all grew up there. Then my dad and mom moved into the house next door,
and my uncle moved into the house down the street. From there, I lived in the house for the next 18 years before I left for college, and I've since moved to a nearby town. The property holds several acres of dense woodland, hills, and steep embankments, with several footpaths tracing throughout that lead to deer camps and hunting stands. Some of the paths also lead to hunting camps that belong to other people who live in the area. When I was 13, I was walking along one of these footpaths when I heard a tree branch break and something land with a loud thud just a couple of yards off the path. I looked over just in time to see something humanoid barreling off into the forest on all fours. It was naked, and its skin was paper white. That was all I could discern. I could only see it for a couple of seconds before it disappeared. I didn't see it again for several weeks, until I was coming out of the forest through a path behind my grandparents' house. It was raining, and I was running to make it back home, when I heard something shuffling around in one of the sheds in my grandparents' backyard. I thought this was weird, considering the sheds were full of clutter and old junk that we didn't even use, so there shouldn't have even been anyone in there. I looked inside, and that's when I saw what I've come to call the pale man up close. It was completely hairless and crouched down in the piles of junk with its back turned to me. It was very thin, with a human-like body, with visible ribs, and strangely long limbs. It looked back over its shoulder to look at me, and I could see that it had deep black eye sockets with wide eyes staring back at me. It didn't have any lips, just teeth, and a mouth pulled back in a horrible grimace. It also didn't have a nose. It screeched at me, and that's when I ran back to my house. I told my dad what had happened, but when he looked to check the shed, gun in hand, he found it completely empty. The next sighting isn't mine, but one I learned of by complete happenstance. I was participating in a summer work program this past summer, and I struck up a conversation with one of the other participants while we were waiting for orientation to begin. It came up that we were both interested in Native American folklore and urban legends, when he asked me if I have ever heard of the rake. Since the rake is the closest thing I've ever been able to find appearance-wise in regards to what I saw all those years ago, I told him my story. He looked shocked when I told him this, and lamented that he had a similar experience, and the details shook me to my core. It happened in 2014, the same year as my experience. It was deer season, and he was sitting up in his deer stand before the sun had come up. While he was waiting, he had heard something scaling the side of his deer stand, which stood 15 feet in the air. He looked over and saw a skeletal face peering into the window. Something was clinging to the side of his stand, whatever it was. It was startled and fell to the ground. He heard it thump against the ground and watched it limp off into the forest. He described it as looking like the Wendigos from the game Until Dawn, a point I also made to my college friend who introduced me to the game. I asked him if he could take me to the place he saw it, but he said he doesn't visit that stand anymore because he's simply too afraid. I still asked him what general area it was in, so I could drive through the area and see if I would find anything. And he did give me an answer, and this is what really startled me. I can't give the exact address, again for privacy reasons, but he said, "So, you know where X road meets Y road? It was right up the road from there." My house was directly on the intersection of those two roads, meaning that whatever he saw was in the general vicinity of the thing that I saw. I didn't get any more information out of him, but I suspected that it happened at one of those deer camps that are connected to my property. This spurred me to look into the matter a bit more seriously. I consider myself an amateur paranormal investigator and have been going on searches through the area in previous weeks. Every now and then I'll hear something really big walking out of sight in the forest nearby, either obscured by trees or on the opposite side of a hill that I'm walking around, somehow always being out of sight. It will walk in sync with me, and when I stop walking, I'll hear it take a few steps before it stops, restarting only when I started walking again. An incident like this happened about a week ago when I heard it trailing directly behind me as I made my way, following a small creek just off of one of the paths. There was a steep hill on my right side, and I walked around the hill and started going in the opposite direction. I could still hear the creature on the other side of the hill. I looked up and I thought I saw something humanoid moving at the top of the hill, ducking to hide behind a thick tree. The hill was too steep for me to climb up to the very top and investigate, so I missed out on that opportunity. I'm not 100% sure that I actually saw something in this instance. It was just a fleeting glimpse, but I do know that I didn't hear any more footsteps following me after this. I went for a full-blown stakeout yesterday. I camped in a clearing near to a deer stand, which is only a couple 100 yards from where my friend had his sighting, and an even shorter distance to where I had my first sighting. I revisited the area where I had my sighting and saw something that piqued my curiosity. The area is full of very steep hills and washouts where rainwater erodes the dirt between these hills, making the area very precarious. There was a downward slope just off the path where I had my encounter, and I saw a collection of sticks stacked together against a tree in the washout. I actually climbed down into the washout to investigate this further. The sticks were assembled, almost like to lean against the tree, but they also curved, kind of in a bowl shape. It looked like something had woven together a nest out of twigs, something about the size of a man could fit into. It also used larger branches, sometimes 3 inches thick, to strengthen the structure. I don't know of any local animal that could have built something like this, and I don't think it was naturally occurring. If this was the work of Pale Man, I don't think he'd have used it correctly. I couldn't find any bones, droppings, footprints, or any sign of something actually living in it. I did take pictures of this nest though, and can upload them. I then returned to my tent and watched the area until the sun went down, and I went to sleep, planning to wake up around 3 a.m. to perform my stakeout. When the time came, I stayed inside my tent and looked out into the night through my tent window. I soon discovered that it was incredibly hard to see in this much darkness, and I couldn't see anything clearly far beyond my tent. I did see something, however, an indiscernible shape situated at the base of 2 conjoined trees. It was way too far away for me to discern what exactly it was, but I know it was about 2 to 3 feet tall. I'm sure you're wondering why I didn't use a flashlight, to which my answer is the only one I had available was the one on my cell phone. It wouldn't have been strong enough to reach whatever was resting at the base of the tree, and if the creature was watching me from nearby, a flashlight certainly would have alerted it, and I was afraid of distressing it and possibly causing it to attack. Although, admittedly, in the times it has been following me through the woods, it's never seemed keen on actually attacking me. It just seems to be curiously observing, just out of sight. I kept my eyes locked on this shape for several minutes, and it didn't do much but move an inch. After about a half an hour of nothing happening, I determined it must have been a bush that looked weird in the complete darkness. I was tired, and what animal could have possibly kept that still for so long? Soon after that, I fell asleep, and then I woke up at 8 the next morning. While I was packing up my things, I looked at the 2 trees where the thing nested beside. There was absolutely nothing there. Not a bush, not a tree stump. The spot where I saw something was completely barren. Maybe there actually was something watching me. I don't know. I don't know if it means anything. I don't know if anything happened or if it was a trick of the eyes or what have you. This is just what I noticed. That's my story. Like I said, I consider myself an amateur paranormal investigator. I'm only showing you this here because I'd like everybody's input on where I should go with this next investigation, as well as any information that you think would help. Whatever I saw very closely resembles the rake or a wendigo. In fact, that's really the only thing I've been able to find that matches up with it. That being said, it's very difficult to find any reliable information on the matter, so I figured I would come here. I will be continuing my searches through the area, and I will be continuing stakeouts, and I do expect to keep you updated if anything comes up. So, I have had several weird experiences in this house since I moved here at the end of May, and have posted about a few. My friend who's a skeptic and his wife came over, and I told them about the encounters, so we started exploring around a bit to see if we could see any shadows or anything. Well, across the street from my house is a grain elevator, and even though it looks like any other grain elevator, it kinda has a creepy vibe to it. My friend, who we will call T, decided to walk over to it around 10 p.m. on August 10th last year. He walked over alone while my wife, T's wife, and myself talked in the front yard. We see T walk back and he looks pale and flushed, and he says he saw a really long bony hand with long bony fingers and a really long arm reach around the corner of the grain silo about 8 or 9 o'clock off the ground, and he shined his flashlight at it and it disappeared. He has never believed in the paranormal or humanoids or anything like that, and he wasn't making it up because we could tell how genuinely scared he was. Well, we were all curious, so he and I walked back over to the area, and we both saw a head pop out of the corner real quick and kept hearing footsteps behind us. We would get these cold patches where the air felt 10 degrees colder, and we would both get covered in goosebumps. We walked for about 10 minutes along the tracks and kept hearing noises and asking each other if we both heard them. We went and got our wives and didn't tell them that we saw or felt and brought them over, and they both said that it felt way colder in certain spots and kept getting goosebumps too. At one point, I swear I felt something brush against my hand. So afterwards, we were standing in my front yard, and I told T what he saw kind of sounded like a skinwalker or wendigo, and started showing him drawings, and he got freaked out and said that is exactly what he saw. We went back over once more to see if we could see any more sightings of it, and he freaked out and looked pale and sweaty, and swears he saw a yellow glowing eye about 9 feet off the ground peering around the building where he and I saw what looked like a head. Like I said, he was super skeptical, and after this, he was terrified and sweating and just looked flushed. I don't know what he saw or what we heard, but it wasn't animals, because it would only be a few footsteps that would stop soon after we did, and whatever he saw was probably 9 feet tall. We even tried to recreate what he saw when he saw the hand, but we couldn't reach as high as he saw it, just standing there on the ground. We both had this feeling of dread and being watched the entire time we walked on the tracks. We were all sober at the time too. No drinking, no drugs of any kind at the time. Sorry for this long story, but I want to give you as much detail as possible. I do live about 5-10 miles from a mass Native American slaughter site in the 1800s and a battlefield. Does anybody else have any stories about a Wendigo or Skinwalker in eastern Washington? I would really love to know. Okay, so my friends and I frequent a park in Shawnee, Kansas. It's right on the Kansas River, and we go there quite often. There have been a couple of nights where we've seen small human-like creatures that are very pale white, have bright yellow eyes, and they tend to stand behind and in trees, swaying their bodies back and forth like an upside-down pendulum. They almost remind me of the Falmer from Skyrim. I've had a couple of buddies say that they've seen them too. A couple of farmers in the area say they've seen their eyes bobbing back and forth from a distance without needing any source of light to cause them to glow. And the one thing that every story has in common, including my own, is that they can move so fast that they almost look like lightning shooting across the tree line. One farmer even claiming that he saw one clear a half-a-mile gap in the blink of an eye. I've seen them a few times, but in all of my experiences, they've stood about 5 feet tall, been incredibly docile and skittish, and generally only appear on foggy nights. Besides the fog, they don't seem to match up to any popular stories I've ever heard about skinwalkers, Wendigo, or rakes. But the similarities in appearance, besides size, matches up perfectly. This really piques my interest, and given my recent introduction to the paranormal, I'm really curious to hear your guys' take on this. This was back in high school, prom night. I was a sophomore loser, just helping take down decorations, so no booze for me. Full disclosure. I was 16 and it might have been 1 a.m. by the time I was driving home from the train station where the prom was held. Actually, a really nice venue, to be honest. This was in rural South Virginia. At the time, I drove this piece of shit 1994 F-150, which was built like a freaking tank. I wasn't super familiar with the roads around the train station, but the one I was on had cornfields on both sides for a few acres back. Then it turned into deep woods. So I'm headed home, doing maybe 45 miles an hour, when all of a sudden, half of my truck pops up and down like I've just hit the mother of all speed bumps on one side. And having just gotten my license, I was like, oh, fuck me. So I pulled over to make sure I hadn't messed up anything and blown a tire. I put the truck in park and looked back for a second and see this huge mass just lying in the middle of the road that 100% was not there when I stopped. My first instinct is, I just killed someone's dog, and my heart drops. I've got my hands on the door handle, ready to go see if this dog is okay, when the hair on my arms stands up. On instinct, I look in the rearview mirror to see the thing getting up, and at first I was stoked, maybe surprised that it was bigger than I thought, but stoked that it was alive. Then it really stood up, like on two legs. Mind you, this was all illuminated by shitty brake lights in the middle of fucking nowhere, and I was pretty freaked out. But when it stood up, I could tell it was kind of hunched over, and even then, it was almost as tall as the 9 or 10 foot corn in the fields. Massive ribcage, emaciated, long face, hollow looking thing just standing up and looks dead at me before shuffling across the road, back into the fields. I drove home, cried a bit, and went to sleep. Found a massive dent in my fender the next morning, and I knew I had really hit something. Fucked me up for a good while, and now I still don't like driving at night. I know skinwalker stories are a little overplayed, but this is genuinely one of the most terrifying experiences I've ever had. For a little context, I'm half Native American, with most of my family being from Oklahoma. I never really believed any of the stories I heard as a kid, until I'm pretty sure I had a real encounter. When I was a kid, maybe 4th grade, me, my mom, and my stepdad would visit my grandparents' property in Texas to shoot guns or fish and whatnot. Their property was surrounded by a couple of acres of land, so sometimes I would wander off from the house and explore wherever I could. One day, I decided to go for a short walk in the woods like normal. Maybe 5 minutes into my walk, mind you, I could still see the house in the distance. I hear my mom's voice say my name. It sounded distant, but so distorted and close at the same time. I called back to her and looked around me. As I was turning around, I see this tall creature with gnarly teeth and gray, tattered skin looking at me from behind a tree. I stood there, completely shocked because of how terrifying this thing looked. It started to move from behind the tree towards my direction, and I took off, running and crying back to the house. This is easily one of the most terrifying things that's ever happened to me, and I never even spoke about it until about a year ago. Before this point, I had never had any cryptid paranormal experiences, but since then, I've had countless wherever I go or move to, despite me being only 18 years old. Like I said, I know skinwalker stories have been a bit overplayed over the past couple of years, but I really wanted to share this and see if anyone around the area has had any familiar or similar experiences in their own. This is both experiences that have happened in the past and something that happened tonight that scared the shit out of me. I have wanted to talk about this for a while, but this one seemed like a homeless person at first. I have a few other encounters I'm tempted to put in from when I was very young, but I'm worried I was just your average overactive kid. Oh, and sorry if some of what I say doesn't make any sense, because my adrenaline is through the roof, and fight or flight instincts are going nuts. So for a few months now, something weird has been hanging around and outside of my house. The first time it became apparent was when one night I was in the basement. Outside the window is a porch, and there is a light switch for the lights by the door. I went upstairs for a bit when I realized later I left the lights on, and I went downstairs to turn them off. When I came down, the porch lights were on. Now, my father has tried endlessly to hook them to a timer with no success to his disappointment. I assumed that he had finally figured it out and paid the lights no mind. What I hadn't known was my dad had given up weeks ago and put it in an average light switch. Next morning, I go down and see the lights are still on. I assume the timer didn't turn them off, so I go to shut them off, and then discover, to my shock, it's a switch. This causes me to panic a bit, because that meant someone had been out there, and the rest of my family was asleep last night, and quite likely, they could have been watching me. By the way, I have an extreme fear of being watched. A few weeks later, I'm sitting downstairs on the couch. I'm home alone. It's the dead of night, and my dog, who is very relaxed with frequent events, but has a habit of being too chill sometimes. Suddenly, she perks up and looks to the window. Out of habit, I look with her and see something hunched over and white dropping down over our fence and running past the windows. Thanks to the dirty windows and the glare of the lights, I couldn't even hope to make out what I saw or how big it was, but I yelped panicked and called my buddies. They were skeptical and told me it was probably a raccoon, and I ended up agreeing. I went outside. My dog's older chocolate lab and my German Pugil, which is a German Shepherd Pug Beagle mix, the one who had been with me. I went out, trying to see what it was right away with my dogs, and had two very different reactions. The lab was pacing and sniffing and looking around and being very anxious. The other was wagging her tail and looking at the trees the way she does when I have treats. Suddenly, from said trees I hear a loud, open groan. These are big, strong old trees, and they don't groan. Not unless something is on them, and the mountain lion who went up them a year ago proved that. Now I tried shining a light up there, but saw nothing. But the trees are thick, and it wasn't until that mountain lion growled last time that I saw him up there in broad daylight. FYI, it is weird seeing mountain lions here. When authorities come through, they ended up determining it was sick and malnourished, so they weren't shocked it wandered into the area. I ended up going inside because my Pugil was moving between the trees with the same look. My lab seemed to be getting increasingly anxious, but now was staying away from the trees and just watching them. My Pugil and me, and I wasn't seeing anything, so. But all night I heard weird things. The worst was a loud slam like a tree branch had fallen, but there was nothing there. And my Pugil kept going to windows and acting unhappy about being kept in. But the rest was like the sound of something on the roof, pebbles being thrown at the window, and the return of a woodpecker, who should have been dead after my cats got the poor thing with a vengeance. Now, here was the climax that drove me here. It's been a couple of months now, and I have mostly forgotten about it. Occasionally, I'll hear something weird on the front porch, or footsteps, or the porch lights will get turned on mysteriously. But they're small things. Tonight, I was with my sister and FaceTiming with a friend in the basement again, when we hear a screeching sound. Now my first concern was my 2 of 3 cat siblings who had taking over the area, which meant they liked to fight the raccoons. Now, the sound didn't sound like any raccoon I'd ever heard, but they do make odd sounds. So I run to the window in the next room, where I believe I'll be able to see them, and then go out to break the fight up from a safe distance. But I instead let out a scream and a flurry of curse words. Outside, standing taller than me for sure, I'm 6 feet, so pretty tall, was a gaunt, white humanoid figure with its back turned to the window. When I got back to the window and looked back out, it was nowhere to be seen. I at first thought it was my mind playing tricks on me. There was snow on the ground, and I was dying for a rational explanation because it scared me bad, and I was shaking. I told my sister, and she just laughed at me. I went upstairs later that night and got everything ready for the night and locked up. When I went back up front, I froze. I could see my cat, who seemed agitated but calm for the most part on the garage roof, looking at something on my porch. That something was the same white figure back, turned again, except this time it was squatted down and looking at my cat. It didn't seem confrontational itself, but then for God's sakes, this sent me into tears. It turned its whole body, twisted, and it seemed to kind of straighten as it did it. I can only think of a meerkat as an example, but it was so sudden. I was sure I heard bones crack through the window. I never saw the face. As soon as it turned, flight or fight kicked in, and ran into my room as fast as I could. The last thing I saw of it, as I slammed my door, was it on the railing as it leaped towards what I assume was a nearby tree. Ever since, I've been in my room, shaking, crying, wheezing in an hysterical fit. I like paranormal stuff, but nobody should have to experience it. Now that I've calmed down enough to type, I've been thinking about its actions and back to previous events. I'm trying to explain this to myself. I at first drew a comparison to the creepypasta creature, the rake. That didn't help my panic, as you can imagine. But the rake was always highly hostile. This thing seemed calm and relaxed most of the time. I don't know what I saw, and it's freaking me out. I want this down before I go crying into sleep. Please, when I wake up, give me an explanation, because I don't want this thing to be real. But this wasn't some homeless guy.